I would like to call to order the City of Lake Forest School District number 67 Board of Education meeting for Tuesday, July 24th. We did have an executive session at 5:30 preceding this meeting, but no action was taken. May I have a roll call, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Andersen.
Present.
Mrs. Fisher.
Present.
Mr. Julian.
Here.
Mr. Pinderski.
Here.
Mrs. Rose.
Present.
Mr. Schuler.
Here.
Mrs. Wold.
Here. This brings us to the President's report. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone in our audience. Thanks for coming. And I would especially like to welcome Mr. Simic at his first board meeting for District 67. Very much looking forward to working together. Know that there's going to be some glitches along the way as we forge a new path, but very much looking forward to that. A couple of things, board members. As you know, we need to complete open session training by January 1st of 2013, and we are intending to do that online, but IASB, that will be available from IASB. It looks like after September 20th. That date keeps slipping. We also were under the impression that there would be training available at the November IASB conference that is held in Chicago, but that it is not going to be available then. So we will keep you posted when that is available, and it is something then that each person would complete on their own. That concludes the President's report and brings us to the Superintendent's report.
Thank you, Mrs. Wold, and it's my honor and privilege to be here and serve the communities of the Lake Forest School District 67 and 115. I want to say thank you to the many people out there who have been so kind and so helpful as I and my family are transitioning into a new state and a new way of life. I'm struck as I drive my kids around one activity or another at the natural beauty that surrounds everyone, and obviously the community mothers and fathers of the past had a great deal of foresight in thinking about how to preserve that natural beauty. I'm also working on an entry plan, meeting with a large number of community members and also elected officials in the various communities and all around the district. Our students, I have two high school kids, and they're already involved in activities, and so meeting parents in that way. I pressed Mrs. Wold into duty the other day and went down and did our best to say hello to some very big football coaches downstairs as part of that, and getting to know the students all around the district, the various activities. Spending time in different buildings as well. And I'm also happy to say that when you move, you write a lot of checks, and so we are making significant contributions to the Illinois economy. And so I look forward to spending more time in different places in the district, and really appreciate the opportunity to serve our families and our children in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simic. That brings us to public participation. Is there any member of the audience who would like to address the board at this time? Seeing none, we will come to reports. There are no reports this evening, and that brings us to our board committees. First, we have the Board of Education Committee, Lesley Fisher and Bill Andersen.
The Board Education Committee has not met in the previous month. We look forward to reconvening in September. Thank you.
Thank you, Lesley. The Board Operations Committee, Laurie, Rose, and Rick Schuler.
Our Board Operations Committee has not met since our last Board of Education meeting, and we will post the date of our next fall meeting on the website.
The Board Finance Committee, Jeff Pinderski and John Julian.
The Board Finance Committee hasn't met since the last time we were here, but there's a couple of significant events going on, and I think Jennifer and I will kind of walk you through them. The first is an update on the 2012 variance analysis, the budget versus actuals for the year that we're closing out. We're finding that there's a $1 million difference in the projected versus actual cash flow, and $1 million to the positive. And rather than just speak about that, I think that I'll let Jennifer do that. The second thing is we're starting the annual budget cycle for the 2013 budget. And tonight we're going to be, I'm going to ask you to approve a draft tentative 2013 budget, which will be put on display for approximately 30 days. During that time, we'll collect community and other stakeholder input, and then meet as a finance committee in August to make any final adjustments based on that input, as well as additional facts that we gather during that time. And the August Finance Committee meeting has yet to be scheduled, but will be posted, and we do encourage community involvement. Jennifer, you want to say a few additional words on those items?
I'll speak a little bit right now about the fiscal year 2012 budget. We'll cover the 2013 when we actually do
when we have to vote
budget.
on it.
We did have a very satisfying conclusion to our year. We were monitoring that throughout the year. We do give year-end projections throughout. We did have some things fall in our favor. I don't control the weather, but I sure appreciated it through this mild winter that we had. We did see significant decreases in utility costs, which was wonderful. We also saw a shift, I think, in some of our supplies as we go to more of a technology-based learning programs, more use of cloud computing. We've seen a decrease in some of the hands-on curriculum supplies that we've previously used. So we saw some of that reduction a little bit in this year's budget, and subsequently in next year's budget have kind of reallocated some of those funds to technology-based learning. Non-tax revenue came in a little bit strong, so we picked up a little bit there, and we also picked up a little bit in salaries, and then correspondingly some of the benefits that relate to those salaries. So overall, a very successful conclusion to the year.
Thank you. And that concludes the Finance Committee report.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. That brings us to district committees in which the board members function as liaisons. And first we have the North Suburban Special Education District, Jeff Pinderski.
On June 13th, the North Suburban Special Education District met and suggested guidelines for member district that they would a number of financial guidelines, and the most important to me is that NSSED would like to keep a larger fund balance at the end of their fiscal year, and I think that they're receiving some pushback from member districts. Certainly their fund balance that they would propose is larger than the one we carry. So I think Dr. Cooley can provide some additional details there.
Yes, thank you. I'd be happy to. So I put a little summary up on the board for you, and as Jeff said, there were a number of things that they were trying to do with their financial agreement with the member districts, and one of them was they were having a cash flow problem when they would see that at right about this time of year because they weren't getting payments from us until August. So they kind of polled a few districts, and they said, would it matter to you if the bill came in July instead of August? And most people said no, that'd be fine. They changed the percentage a little bit, so that should help a cash flow problem because they didn't want to confuse the cash flow issues with a possible need for reserves. But on the other hand, they had been using their reserves like all districts have, and they were trying to look at the group, and you've got 18 member districts, what is an appropriate amount of reserve to have, and in a case of NSSED that is basically tuition based, what type of reserve do you need? They also polled other special education cooperatives to determine what they would do. Some of the discussions, it's not finished, although there'll be discussion in the August meeting, so if you have comments that you would want Jeff to take to the August meeting, this would be the time. They've settled on, they started with a larger target in terms of a fund balance. They started, they looking now at about 15 to 18%, which would be about $6 million. They have, a reserve now, so they wouldn't be trying to raise that full amount. Or another option is, though, if they were to get into a crisis, and the type of crisis they're looking at might be just complete stoppage of some funds they would get from Illinois. So the personnel reimbursement, as an example, is a very large source of revenue to them. So if that were to collapse, what could they do? So is there a mechanism, if that were to collapse, would the member districts all agree at that point to kind of help rather than amass a larger reserve? Kind of the two things that are on the table right now. I do know that in August, their August meeting, and they will not meet in September, I've been told that if the 18 member districts discuss this item, it doesn't have to be voted on in August. However, if there seems to be a lot of agreement, there could be a vote. And so we, one of 18 districts will have to abide by the group should, it's possible that others will disagree with our position, which our position is that, and I'm sorry, I used that last, it says 115, but it would be for 67 also, would be that we need a little bit more information. I worked closely with Alan and Jennifer said, well, if that problem occurred, really what would be the difference between the risk and what would be needed? It clearly won't be $6 million, so exactly what is that risk? So I would hope that all 18 member districts would at least study it for a while longer rather than make a decision. Now, to our district, 67, it would be about a little over $90,000. We could pay it over 3 years. But to our communities, including Lake Bluff, it would be over $200,000. So I don't think this is a decision that districts should make lightly. It's a different impact on the different districts. Any questions? And I apologize for the 115. I was going to change the background.
No,
green
it's
from
it's
blue
okay. It's okay. I think one of the questions that's on everybody's mind here, and I just don't have as clear an answer as I need yet. What other options for reserve liquidity has NSSCD explored? Because I think I think this notion of an emergency is on one hand good, but on the other hand, that's why we have insurance, except for the state of Illinois not paying, right? So the question is about reserve liquidity and what else they could do.
Right. And I don't know if we wanted Jennifer to give an example, but she could give a great example that, exactly where the risk might fall. And I think it goes to your question, too. And, and really, if they did have a problem like that, we'd all be facing a similar problem if some of those, the funding from the state stopped. But yet they would have to go on, and I think we would all agree on that. So how could we do that option 2, so creating some kind of different mechanism that didn't mean our money just sitting there?
And my concern is that across the 18 districts in the cooperative, there's varying levels of reserve balances, right? I mean, financial soundness. And I don't want to be in a position where we're backstopping other districts that haven't done the cuts and had the discipline that we, that the stronger districts have had. And that's a real concern of mine.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel as though we've been talking about NSSCD and their funding mechanisms on an almost monthly basis, and we've come so far. It feels like a little bit of a backstep. But again, if Jeff votes a certain way, if Monty from the high school votes a certain way, if Mary Beth from 65, that's only 3 of 18. Even that they can't carry a vote, but they certainly can create a robust discussion on the topic.
There will be a robust discussion on the topic. And that concludes the NSSCD report.
Thank you, Jeff. So this will be an ongoing story. Hopefully this is not
Hopefully
decided
not.
in August, right? Okay. That brings us to the Illinois Association of School Boards and EdRed. Bill Andersen.
There is no report this month.
Thank you, Bill. Professional Development, Rick Schuler.
Nothing to report from the last month here either.
Curriculum Coordinating Committee, Laurie Rose.
No report this month.
And the Spirit of 67 Foundation, there is no report this month. Is there any other committee that has met that a board member would like to report on? Seeing none, that brings us to our recommendations, the recommendations portion. First, we have the approval of IASB board policy updates. These are the second reading from last month. Board members, we did approve those on first reading. We did have a question about the EpiPen policy.
I could speak to that if you.
Thank you,
if
Dr.
have
Cooley. That would be
just
great.
generally, and
Yes.
see if there's still questions. So there's a new into the policy is an option for us. It's not a required a piece of the policy. And the option is if we were able to get a doctor to prescribe an EpiPen, which is used for students who are going into anaphylaxis shock, it could be used on any student. And the reason for that is that students can potentially have an allergy and be completely unaware of it. Obviously, those things develop at different times in different individuals. So again, it's an option for us to provide that and for the nurses and or other qualified staff to use in the case of an emergency on students who don't have that as a prescribed medication. Our students who currently need EpiPens for allergies would still need to continue to have those in the nurse's office. So it wouldn't be the kind of thing of we've got a free supply of medication and we're just putting it out there. It would only be used in an emergency on students who didn't already have an EpiPen. I have located a physician who's local here who actually has children who also have allergies who is willing to prescribe one for us. But if you decide to put this into the policy, if we weren't able to get a doctor or if we weren't able to fill the prescription that this doctor gives us, we wouldn't be bound to it even if it's put into the policy. So I think there's a little bit of a safeguard there if something falls through. I would work with the school nurses to develop a little bit of procedure around this. So it would be who would the name be on the prescription? If I did it or any of you did it, does that do anything to our health record that shows that we need an EpiPen? So there'd be a few things that we would want to work through. Should only the nurses be able to use it, or should an administrator be able to, with training, do that? So there'd be some, and they could. So there'd just be some procedures that we would put into place if you choose to put it in there, and then we also get a prescription that can be filled.
Thank you, Dr. Cooley. Are there any other questions about the board policies?
I just have a procedural question which maybe hasn't been worked out yet. Assuming we approve this with the option for the school to maintain an EpiPen, which I, as a lifelong EpiPen user and allergy sufferer, I strongly support it could save lives, then how does our present permission system, where we have parents presumably authorize emergency treatment, would that cover not only at a hospital but also permit our staff or school nurses to administer those EpiPens?
Well, according to the policy, there'd be a hold harmless type of agreement that goes along with the policy, so there wouldn't be a danger of someone using it inappropriately and then having those kinds of concerns. I think that there are a few issues that we would need to look at, including and procedurally look at our forms to see. We may want to put another statement on there to make that one a little bit more prominent, at least at the very beginning, and we certainly would rely on Ann Whipple to guide us on that.
Thank you.
Any other questions, board members? So may I have a motion to approve the IASB board policy updates second reading?
So moved.
Second.
I second.
Roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk. Aye.
Mrs. Rose,
Aye.
Mr. Julian,
Aye.
Mr. Andersen,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Motion carries. That brings us to the approval of the Sheridan School lighting proposal. Alan Albus.
Thank you. There's a rare medical condition that some people have that where they're sensitive to the flickering of fluorescent lights, and it's my understanding that that can cause, in extreme cases, almost epileptic convulsions. We have a student that will be attending Sheridan School this fall. I don't think it's quite to that extreme. It's a family that Julie has been working with, but there is a documented medical sensitivity to fluorescent lights. And there is a cure for it, and we've tested it, which is changing out the ballasts in the school to change the way that they flicker. And what I'm talking about is something that I don't think most of us can even perceive. But there are people that do, and it can make them very ill. So Carol will talk a little bit. She obtained 3 quotes to change out the ballasts, and the lights are just the ballasts at Sheridan School.
The ballast, the lights, and we are adding sleeves to the lights to protect from UVA, UVB, which she has a sensitivity to as well. So I want to start, are you ready? I want to start out by apologizing. In your board packet, you have the wrong recommendation for a vendor. I wrote up the wrong one, so I asked Eileen to put them on the correct one on your packet. I am recommending Mead Electric for the lighting retrofit at Sheridan School. They came in at $48,660, and we have worked with this vendor many, many times in the past on various projects, and they are a very reputable and reliable vendor, so I highly recommend them. And that's it. And again, I apologize for the wrong memo in your packet. Any questions or?
This is something, board members, that we did review at the Operations Committee. I think
the last meeting.
The last meeting and the one before when we were actually at Sheridan and we walked around the school.
Right.
So it has been reviewed by the Operations Committee.
Correct.
Any questions, board members?
And thank you. I did read it 3 times, wondering what I was missing, but I see
With
it
me,
now.
I'm
so
sorry.
I feel better.
Thank you.
Okay, may I have a motion to approve the Sheridan School lighting proposal?
So moved.
Second.
May I have a roll call, please, Madam Clerk?
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Julian?
Aye.
Mr. Schuler?
Aye.
Mrs. Rose?
Aye.
Mr. Andersen?
Aye.
Mrs. Wold?
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski?
Aye.
Motion carries.
I will add, I noticed something in this reading, Carol, that we do save electricity costs of, I think it was like $3,500 a year. Not a whole lot, but I don't remember that being discussed, and at least
No, it wasn't. It was a performance services came in with that recommendation. It's a good plan. It's just that they're not coming in under the 50,000 window that we have. It changes from 4 ballast lamps to 2 ballast lamps at a 28 watt instead of a 30 watt. So there is some savings there at Sheridan, but they were not the lower vendor. So Mead Electric is just going to change. You know, it's going to be oranges for oranges. They're just going to change out the bulbs, sleeve them, and the ballasts.
Okay, thank you. This brings us to the approval of the Whipple Consulting contract. Mr. Simic?
Thank you, Mrs. Wold. I was speaking with a community member this past week and discussing the various ways why I found Mrs. Whipple's services so valuable. And the person responded that, well, that would be interesting information to share with other people. And so I'll give a thumbnail sketch of some of that, some of those things that I find so valuable about working with her. First and foremost are the number of contacts that Mrs. Whipple enjoys with media all around the local area, but also state and even national contacts in a variety of ways. And then beyond that, the community groups with whom she is frequently, that she knows very, very well. Related to that are the number of people that express uniform appreciation for her from our various community groups that I speak to and speak to me. In a word, she is E.F. Hutton on school matters in their view. Also, one of the things that is easily overlooked is the fact that, especially given the challenges of this past year, that Mrs. Whipple does far, far more than simply review copy and read communications to parents for review. She really is very connected to our students, to our staff, and to our parent community in a way that far, far exceeds what one would think of as a consultant. He performs in every manner as if she is an employee of the district. For me personally, as somebody who needs all the assistance I can get in my transition, she serves as both a guide and a coach, and hopefully helping me successfully transition into the role that I've got here. So I recommend wholeheartedly its approval.
Any questions, board members?
I just had a couple of comments, if I could. Is that possible? I've always liked Ann, and I think that Mike needs the flexibility to make his own decisions and pick his own team in terms of managing the school district and everything. That said, I think there's a couple things people could keep in mind when voting on this contract. First of all, it's a consulting contract. Ms. Whipple's not an employee, and there'd probably be about another $25,000 in benefit costs if she were an employee. And another way to think about that is you could probably subtract about $25,000 from the cost of this contract when looking at comparable salaries. So I think that's relevant. Secondly, however, this recommendation doesn't come with any comparable salary data, which I don't think is appropriate for a high-profile position like this. And I'll just point out that last year we didn't receive any comparable salary data either until after the vote. Just one other comment. I think the job specifications in the contract are extremely vague. I think Ann does a great job, but having the specifications be so vague, I think this gives the board and community very little basis on which to evaluate her performance. So my recommendation would be to renew this contract, if possible, for 6 months or until a proper documentation of, or description of her responsibilities and salary comps could be made available to the board.
Any other questions, board, or comments, board members?
I had a couple things. I noticed in reviewing this contract that it's virtually identical in its organization in terms to the contract for Ed Tech, which will come up later in our agenda. And I feel, echoing some of Mr. Anderson's comments, that the description of the scope of work is rather vague. It offers us no opportunity to evaluate. In particular, I have some concerns with the termination for cause, which is very deficient compared to the private sector. It gives us very few options. As long as some services are provided, if anything else happens, both the consultant and the school district remain on the hook for the contract. So I would move to support Mr. Anderson's recommendation to table the contract, or rather to extend it for 6 months and reevaluate both the terms and the compensation features.
While we're at this, I have something I would like to see added as well. Again, I also think Ann Whipple does a fantastic job and has been very helpful. There are a couple things I don't understand. One is the amount of time committed. You know, it says 10 months per year, but it's not clear to me, is it a full-time or part-time? And are her services able to be offered to other clients? And how would that eat into our time, I guess? So it's not so much, with the other questions are still out there, but this sort of adds to it, is what is the time commitment?
One of the things brought up is the number of months of the contract is 10 months. And one of the things that I intend to do is to ask Mr. Albus to get with Mrs. Whipple about extending that and making that a 12-month agreement. Seems to be that will reflect more accurately the work that Mrs. Whipple does. Also, in terms of consultants working for other groups, in my experience, it's not within the purview of one contract holder's contract to stipulate what other outside work might occur with that. And so our contract is silent on that, as I think is customary. Does that fully answer your concern?
Yeah, I would agree with you that it should not restrict working for other clients, but it's not clear to me how much time we get from the contract.
That's a interesting point. One of the things that I've observed is that Mrs. Whipple seems to be there every time that we need her, and whether that's morning, noon, or night, and seems to be in the office whenever she seems to be needed. And so the contract doesn't stipulate that, not a minimum or a maximum. But in my experience, and obviously I haven't been here a great deal yet, but even prior to being an employee here, I was in regular contact with Mrs. Whipple, and it was 24/7.
And actually, you've just arrived, but you're right. She's everywhere. and I like that. That's a good thing. But I'm just addressing the contract itself.
I think in reviewing this contract, what I saw in it and what I've seen, knowing Anne in this setting for the past few years in different capacities, is that it would be very hard to quantify and qualify in a contract exactly her hours, because as it says here, she is available 24/7, has been available, and will be available. I am confident moving forward. I think it's very difficult to qualify in this contract.
I will say personally, having worked with Anne, that I've spoken with her at 7 in the morning, and I've spoken with her on the weekends, and I have talked to her after 10 o'clock at night. So I echo Leslie's comments, and I would please ask board members to, if you have a comment about the contract, they need to be made publicly, and rather than in a sidebar fashion. Thank you.
I'd like to move at this time to extend the contract for 6 months. This would give Mr. Simic and the rest of the board a chance to review market comparable information, a chance to assess the contract and its terms in terms of availability and the scope of work, and it also would provide Mrs. Whipple an opportunity for continuity of work. I'd like to put this to a vote.
Second?
Are we open for discussion?
Yes.
Okay, I heard an alternate point of view, which was the superintendent suggesting making it an annual contract, and also, perhaps adding some terms that reflect some of the concerns. And I think we should have perhaps just a bit more discussion on that, because I think it is such an important position, and I want to make sure that the right amount of discussion goes into the structuring of this. And what I'm hearing is that perhaps there hasn't been the right amount of discussion that's happened at this point.
Okay, but we do have a motion on the table, which is to change it to to have approve the contract for 6 months. Do we have a second for that motion?
Second.
So may I have a roll call vote, please, on that motion?
Mr. Julian?
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Nay.
Mrs. Wold?
Aye.
Mr. Schuler?
Aye.
Mrs. Rose?
Aye.
Mr. Andersen?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So the motion carries for a 6-month contract. So that will be beginning immediately. We will have that discussion again then basically early in 2013. This brings us to the approval of the EdTech Solutions contract.
Yeah, this is, EdTech is also known as Cornelius DeBose, and Cornelius is also with us here tonight. And in my experience with Mr. DeBose, he's effective and incredibly helpful, knowledgeable, available and uniformly praised around the district, and I recommend the contract's approval.
Discussion and questions, board members?
I have a question on this. I would renew my concerns about the structure of the contract, but apart from that, I would ask Mr. DuBose, your contract is much reduced from your prior years, I see, and we're getting a new director of instructional, I think the title is instructional technology. So I was wondering how you plan to interface with that new individual and how this contract reflects possibly a change in responsibilities.
It reflects that the director of instructional technology exists. The director of instructional technology is principally responsible for instructional technology, not the operational side of technology, not keeping servers going, not repairing machines, not doing those things. And so that is principally that and managing the overall technology that's not educational, what the contract reflects.
So would you be available on an ongoing basis throughout the year for those operational issues, and any basically non-instructional issue would still fall within your area of responsibility?
Yes, the director of instructional technology and I have met and sort of outlined what those responsibilities are, and yes, that accurately reflects what those responsibilities
Thank you.
are.
Any further questions, board members? Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the EdTech Solutions contract?
So moved.
Second?
Second?
May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Andersen,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Julian,
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski,
Aye.
Mrs. Rose,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Wold,
Aye.
motion carries.
Motion carries. This brings us to the approval of the resolution to display the tentative budget for 2012 and 13. Jennifer Hermes.
Thank you, Board. In accordance with the Illinois School Code, we are presenting to you tonight the 2012-13 tentative budget. We've included for your review both the state form, which I find not all that friendly, and also a district version, which hopefully you'll find a little bit more friendly. The budget was very carefully developed with a connection of requests to not only our district goals, but our building goals and program initiatives. We had a wonderful opportunity. Each school and department did come and present to a budget committee. The committee was able to hear their presentation, ask questions, and see exactly what each department or school was recommending for the upcoming year. As I did state, this is a tentative budget. We have the opportunity up to the point of budget adoption in September to make any adjustments. We do carefully monitor economic conditions and other variables up until that point. We do have a few of those out there. We will hear about one of them later on the agenda, but we do have a couple of other items that we're keeping a close eye on. For those of you who have attended prior board meetings or had an opportunity to hear the committee reports, we have the CUBE project, which has been discussed in Education Committee, Finance Committee, and the Operations Committee. Construction or renovation for the CUBE project will be included in the final budget presented in September. However, we do not yet have all of the costs associated with that. We also have the agenda item that you will see with the tile change order. Mr. Elvis will speak about that, but we do believe once we have final costs on that, there will be an adjustment before that in September. And then finally, we're keeping a close eye on some enrollment and staffing issues, working carefully with the building principals and curriculum. We do have a couple of classrooms perhaps on the bubble, so a couple of kids either way could make some of those changes. So potentially we could have a few staffing adjustments coming into September. So we'll carefully monitor those. What's before the board tonight is a resolution that basically does three things. One, it does authorize us to put on display for public preview a minimum of 30 days, which since we do not have a board meeting in August, it will actually be on display throughout September. We do put both formats on display, although that's not required. We will advertise the notice and availability of that budget for review in local paper. And also it sets September 25th, which is the date of the next board meeting, as our public hearing. At that time, we will do a more formal presentation of the budget including some more details and specifics, and of course, these final numbers of the items that I just discussed. At that time, anybody so willing to make a public comment is able to comment on the budget. The hearing is held just prior to the start of the actual board meeting, for those that are interested. The resolution in front of you tonight accomplishes those three things and are required by the Illinois School Code.
Any questions, board members? Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the resolution to display the tentative budget for 2012 and 13?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mrs. Rose?
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski?
Aye.
Mr. Schuler?
Aye.
Mrs. Vold?
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher?
Aye.
Mr. Julian?
Aye.
Mr. Andersen?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. This brings us to the approval of the tile change order, and Alan Albus.
Thank you. In May of this year, the Board of Education awarded a contract for the replacement of approximately 30,000 square feet of tile at Deer Path Middle School to Vortex Enterprises. Prior to Vortex commencing their work, most of the area slated for replacement had to be abated due to asbestos tile and/or mastic. That work was awarded to NES Incorporated. Shortly after Vortex began their work, two circumstances emerged which necessitated change orders. The first one involved labor and material for stair risers in the lecture room that were inadvertently omitted from the original bid specs. The second change order was for additional labor and materials to prepare floors and fix areas where the conditions of the floors were not reasonably foreseeable at the time the contract was signed. The work included the preparation of rusted channels and subfloors. When they abated the tile, what they found were some channels in the floors, metal channels that carry, where's Carol, wire, we're assuming? But those had, over time, rusted, and adhesive would not adhere to that. So that had to be prepped. Installation of moisture membranes and the leveling of floor drains that were discovered, and floor cleanouts. Several days later, after approximately 12,000 square feet of tile had been installed, the vendor noticed that the tile was curling at the edges and the seams. And that was, I believe, on July 11th. And in the audience tonight is Mr. Del Church from Vortex Enterprises. Del, if you'd raise your hand. At that point, Mr. Church called Carol and said there's a problem here. Now, of particular note is that there were several areas that were where tile was removed but not abated because it was not asbestos. Where those areas were retiled, the adhesive and the tile are adhering fine, and there's been no issues. So on July 12th, Carol convened a meeting that included Mr. Church, a representative from the adhesive company, the asbestos consultant that we utilize, the asbestos abatement company, and I believe a representative from the tile company. The consensus from that meeting was that somehow the mastic remover used to abate the asbestos had wicked into the concrete. And then when the new floor was being laid, it was reacting with the adhesive and basically dissolving it and causing it not to adhere. Following that meeting, Carol White engaged the services of Mr. Howard Kinnear from the CTL group. Mr. Kinnear specializes in forensic investigations relative to concrete construction. On Tuesday, July 17th, under Mr. Kinnear's direction, concrete core samples were taken and analyzed. And the purpose of the analysis was to determine the best way to remedy the dissolving of the adhesive. In a report that Mr. Kinnear provided today, in a verbal report, and he's going to step to the microphone in a moment, he's going to talk about the remedy and the condition that was discovered. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Mr. Howard Kinnear of CTL.
Hi, good evening. I'm Howard Kinnear from CTL Group. We're an independent consulting, research, and testing organization wholly owned by the Portland Cement Association in Skokie. We've been around for almost 100 years or so. And my particular group specializes in forensic investigations of flooring systems. 1 week ago, we came out to the site and took samples of the adhesive and concrete cores from the building, and over the last few days have had them analyzed and determined that the chemical that was used to remove the old adhesive was indeed contaminating the concrete to a depth of almost ½ an inch in some locations, and that when the new tile had been installed, that chemical was working its way back up into the new adhesive, causing it to soften and the tiles to release from the floor. So based on what we found, we looked for some solutions, and having done this sort of work for many years, we knew that there were very few options. What we're recommending is that an organization, a company called Koster, K-O-S-T-E-R, Koster USA, provide the materials and a vendor provide the services to shot blast the surface of the concrete, which will remove the bulk of the contamination near the surface and provide an open porous concrete which can then be cleaned with a detergent and the chemicals removed substantially from the concrete. A coating then, which is a special type of epoxy, would be applied to the concrete, and then on top of that a skim coat of an underlayment, and finally we can install the tile on top of that. Having done this work for a number of years, I had contacts throughout the industry, and I've talked to a lot of people over the past week. We don't believe there's any other technical solution that would solve the problem. And so other than removing a great depth of the concrete, we think the solution will allow the work to be performed as quickly as possible and should provide an enduring solution, and that the vendor has offered a 10-year warranty against failure due to the chemicals that are currently contaminating the concrete.
So before you tonight, because the time window, due to the cost of the change orders and the fact that there's not enough time to bid and complete the additional work prior to the start of school, Attorney Brian Crowley has prepared the attached resolution approving and ratifying the change orders and approving and ratifying the award of emergency contract to perform the work. Now, by school code, this must be approved by 3/4 of the board to meet the emergency exception provision in the school code's bidding provisions. The costs involved on this are quite substantial. So for the stair risers, for the initial repair of the floors, for the grinding, the preparation in the ceiling, and the encapsulation of the residual mastic remover that Mr. Kinnear spoke of, and the replacement of the floor tile that had been laid and curled, plus a little allowance for some additional labor to make sure we can complete this before school starts, we're looking at a change order of $328,000, $942,942.98. I would like to say that this is a multi-step process. Obviously, when we encountered the problem, the first step is determine the condition of the concrete, what is causing this to happen, which would then allow the development of a remedy to the situation of the adhesive not adhering. And that's been done through the work of Mr. Kinnear. Tonight, we're asking you to implement the solution, which is the approval of the change order. The next steps in this process, though, would be to determine what caused the condition, and then from that point, we'll proceed accordingly.
Are there any questions, board members?
No, I would just say that I think the right process has been done. I think it's been done as quickly as could be done. I think the conclusions reached so far are clear, and most importantly, I think we have little choice. We have to get this done, or the school doesn't open. The concrete has to be cleaned up. The new tile has to be put down. But as you said, this is a multi-step process. We'll be looking for more conclusions later. What did cause it, and what recourse do we have potentially to one or two of the vendors to get reimbursed for some of this cost. But at this time, I see no choice but to go forward.
Any, Bill?
I
Andersen?
would agree with Mr. Schuler that we obviously need to go ahead and get the school ready for the new school year. And Mr. Kinnear, thank you for being here. You look like you have terrific qualifications to talk about this, including being named one of the top 10 most influential people in the concrete industry. So could you address, from your standpoint, any sort of public health concerns, and how will the school be certified to be safe before we let teachers and kids back in?
I think that's perhaps a question that Carol might better answer, and we probably might want to consider having an industrial hygienist look at some of the materials that are going to be used in the building. It's my understanding.
I'm sorry, have a what?
An industrial hygienist perhaps review the materials safety data sheets for the products that are going to be used, but it's my understanding that the process involves, for the most part, non-hazardous materials. Anything that becomes hazardous by virtue of being removed from the site is going to be disposed at the expense of the vendor. If it has to be disposed as hazardous material, they would do that. Sorry if I surprised you.
No, that's okay, that's okay. We did have the air quality tested after the abatement by Camplin Environmental, and everything was clear. That was the only hazardous concern that we had with the building, and that's why it was a full containment abatement project. And it was all clear before the containment was removed, so we're fine.
The asbestos has all been removed and
Gone.
contained, and the air is
Everything's
already
gone.
clear.
It was tested afterwards, it's completely clear. We got it all clear from Camplin Environmental.
Okay, thank you.
To follow up on Bill's question, can you comment, though, after the top layer of the concrete is stripped out or, sort of shot off, you're putting another substance on it to seal it and to give a better texture for the tile, the new glue and the tile to stick to. Can somebody comment on that? I don't want to use the word chemical, but whatever is being used at that point.
Having been trained as a chemist, I'm proud to say everything is a chemical.
Well, comment on the chemical then, please.
After the concrete surface has been shot blasted, there's a detergent that's used to remove the bulk of the contaminant that's in the concrete. And then the floor is repeatedly washed with high temperature water and suction to clean it. Whatever trace chemical is left in the concrete from the original abatement is going to be sealed with an epoxy. And that epoxy type chemical is a material which polymerizes, meaning it links up and hardens on the surface of the floor. It should have no odor, and there will be no residues left to be detectable in the air of the building. That will then be encapsulated itself with a layer of a cementitious underlayment. So there will be a material that contains cement and sand, which is mixed with water, has other chemicals in it, and that's poured on the surface and leveled out and provides a hard, flat, dense surface, which will look like a concrete floor. And then the concrete underneath that, the contamination in that concrete is therefore encapsulated. So that once this process is complete, the flooring installers will be able to proceed just as they would with a normal flooring installation. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Any further questions, board members?
Mr. Kinnear, you stated that you've worked with this particular chemical or compound or group of compounds in the past.
Which ones are we talking about?
Well, I'm not a chemist. The first, we blast off the surface effectively, and then a first chemical is applied, then there's a bunch of washing, then a second chemical is applied, if my understanding is correct.
What you just referred to as the second chemical is a sealer. That's
Okay.
an epoxy which is basically painted onto the surface, and it bonds very tightly to the surface, and it hardens up, right?
So you have experience with both the sealer and the first chemical?
Yes.
And you feel that these are safe products for use in schools?
Yes, in fact, there's a history, and we have some references, if you'd like, I'll provide to Carol, where these products have been used before.
Thank you.
Have you seen a situation exactly like this before?
No. I have worked on several projects over the years with the abatement chemicals, for the most part where the abatement chemicals were used and there was essentially no residue in the floor. So in those situations, the abatement chemicals were not the cause of a problem. This particular class of chemicals, it's a soybean derivative, I've not encountered before.
Thank you.
Any further questions, board members? Seeing none, may I have a motion to approve the tile change order?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Vold,
Aye.
Mr. Andersen,
Aye.
Mrs. Rose,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski,
Aye.
Mr. Julian.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Motion carries. This brings us to the approval of the 2012-13 staff compensation. Mr. Simic?
Thank you, Mrs. Wold. I'd like to recommend the approval of the compensation as presented.
That's as was presented in executive session. Do I have a motion to approve the 2012-13 staff compensation as discussed in executive session?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mrs. Vold,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mrs. Rose,
Aye.
Mr. Andersen,
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski,
Aye.
Mr. Julian,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler.
Nay.
Motion carries 6-1. This brings us to our consent agenda items. First, we have the adoption of resolutions to update bank signer information with both Lake Forest Bank and Trust and Northern Trust. Secondly, we have the approval of minutes of both a regular meeting and an executive session on June 26th, 2012. We have the approval of disbursements, payrolls, and financial statements for June 2012. Total disbursements of $1,435,910.47. Total payrolls of, $2 million. It's actually total disbursements of $2,145,576.87. And then the June 2012 financial report. Sorry, that was total. I don't know why I'm confusing myself. That was total payrolls of $2,145,576.87. You know, this financial report hasn't changed, but for some reason I had problems reading it. Then the approval of human resource items, including leave requests, new staff, retirements, and status changes. And under the record of closed meetings, we have the disposal of audio recordings from January 27th of 2010, February 23rd of 2010, March 23rd of 2010, April 8th of 2010, April 27th of 2010, May 7th of 2010, May 25th of 2010, June 28th of 2010, July 26th of 2010, September 28th of 2010, and October 4th of 2010. Any item may be removed from the consent agenda at the request of a board member. Is there any such request?
I have a minor question on one of the items. Do we have to remove it to ask the question? I'll remove it just to avoid the doubt. I guess maybe Mr. Malin can answer this. The new Latin teacher at DPM East, is this a replacement?
Good evening. Yes, it is a replacement of a teacher who's going to a different state.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so may I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
May I have a roll call vote, please, Madam Clerk?
Mr. Andersen,
Aye.
Mrs. Fisher,
Aye.
Mr. Julian,
Aye.
Mr. Pinderski,
Aye.
Mrs. Rose,
Aye.
Mr. Schuler,
Aye.
Mrs. Vold.
Aye. Motion carries. FOIA requests. We had FOIA requests from Lisa Black of the Chicago Tribune in Schaumburg, Illinois, from Nancy Thorner on Blodgett Avenue in Lake Bluff, Illinois, and then also again from Lisa Black of the Chicago Tribune in Schaumburg, Illinois. Announcements. Tuesday, September 25th, we had a Board of Education meeting scheduled at 7 p.m. at right here at the West Campus. In addition, we do have a board member workshop which is scheduled for August 20th. And that is jointly with the District 115 board members. That brings us to adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.